Hello, and welcome to the next episode of the Existential Files.
Hello, Louie. How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you. Today we're joined by another very special guest, and as always, our guests are very special because they take their time out of their day to come and chat with us. Today we're joined by, now, am I pronouncing this right? Emmy van Deurzen, is that correct?
That's fine, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good pronunciation. Sometimes we say names completely wrong and guests get annoyed with us. You are a philosopher, I believe, and an existential analyst, and you're also quite a prominent academic too, if that's a reasonable introduction.
That's fair enough.
Yeah. I mean, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself for listeners?
Well, you summed it up. I have committed my life to studying philosophy and to understanding human existence, both in a philosophical and a psychological way, and to help people live their lives in a better fashion, if possible.
Which sounds exactly the kind of person we want to have on this podcast.
This is just what we need.
This podcast kind of help. Is exactly about what it is to be a human being in the universe, and what a bizarre and strange thing it is too. So I think Matthew, you had a
well. Let's even just go straight into, and so Emmy, again, thank you for joining us. And so Louie mentioned existential therapy. You're saying your interest is in helping people with this. So could you just tell us, if it's possible, what do we mean by existential therapy?
Yes, existential therapy is the therapy of existence. So it is to help people understand about life rather than help them with psychotherapy, which is the therapy of the psyche, which is to help them just with their inner psychology. Now, if we're going to work with human existence, that means we will still pay attention to what is happening in people's inner world, but we will also pay more attention to what is happening in their physical world, and also what is happening in their social world, which could include culture and politics as well. And in addition to that, we will also make room to think about what a person's values are and what they believe about the world. So we make room to investigate their ideas and their understanding of the world and even of the universe. So it includes a spiritual dimension as well as a social, a personal, and a physical dimension.
So whenever somebody would be just exploring these questions related to what's it all about, what's my place in the universe, how might I best live my life, they may come to you for that kind of help and support. Do you find that do you find that people will come, I'm going to say with this phrase, with problems, with a particular issue they want addressed, or is it, like you say, those broad questions that we've touched upon there?
Yes, interesting. I think people come to existential therapists with pretty much the same issues and the same troubles and the same problems that they would take to any other therapist. But they might be a little surprised to find that there are these different ways of looking at their issues, and that rather than them just digging deeper and deeper into their own inner hang-ups, they will actually dig themselves out of a hole and see how they are connected to the world at large, to the people around them, to also society, and to politics, culture, and the world beyond that. So it is helping people to get a broader perspective on why things have become problematic for them, and to help them envisage these things from a sense of understanding rather than blaming, either blaming themselves or blaming their parents or blaming anything in particular that has happened to them. It's about seeing the problems that have happened to them as part of human existence. You know, we all get screwed about by life. We all get tripped up by events, and to actually find a space in which you can explore these things without blaming either yourself or other people is incredibly liberating. And I think that is of what we do, to help people liberate themselves and broaden their perspective and deepen their understanding of what is possible for a human being to change in their lives, and how it is possible to engage with that very passionately and very deeply.
Emmy, if I could ask you a question. So, I mean, I consider myself an existentialist, and for me, existentialism is about, autonomy and power, but power can be difficult to deal with as well as liberating. I mean, do you find that sometimes your clients find that liberation difficult as well as empowering?
It's always difficult. And it's always paradoxical. So when you say existentialism is about autonomy and power, I could say the opposite. Existential views are also about exploring the lack of autonomy and the limits of power. And it is the way in which we explore those issues by understanding that every time I affirm my own freedom, I discover also my limits and my boundaries. And every time I ask for something for myself, I intrude on the freedom of others. It is by understanding the complexity of those tensions and paradoxes and limitations in life that we become more free or more enabled to find our way through all these obstacles and all these contradictions.
And I want to ask then, we have two of our previous guests on the podcast, I believe, have been former students of yours. A gentleman called Nick Brown, who I know through work in positive psychology, and also Yannick Jacob, who again works in the area of coaching psychology. And I think one of his, or at least it may be a term come from you, but bringing this idea of existential coaching. So I'm not sure if it's something which is kind of taking what you're doing and developing it, or whether it's just a way of describing what you're describing. I guess, is that a term you're familiar with? Is it something that you say, well, actually, what we're describing in terms of therapy could also be described as coaching, or is there something qualitatively different?
Well, I do all of that. So I have published a book on existential coaching, and whereas counselling might be more for people who come to GP practices or who just want to have a conversation about their problems, psychotherapy would be a deeper, more long-term intervention with people who find themselves with deep psychological and emotional problems. But they just are different because of the different settings in which you use those methods. So with existential coaching, you would be working in an organization, and you would be working on very specific issues of how a person experiences themselves at work most often, or how a person wants to tackle one particular question in their lives. Whereas with counseling, it would be slightly more long-term and more psychological in nature. And with psychotherapy, it might be about deep-seated emotional and psychological issues. So it all depends on how you frame the work, but you would still use the same overall perspective of philosophical investigation of all the different layers of human existence.
Okay, so that's really helpful. Thank you for that. And I know, I'm not sure, Louie, if you could pick up on this then, because one of our previous guests, I think possibly just the very last episode, we started to touch upon the idea of so-called mental illness. Louie, do you want to pick up on that and see what some thoughts are there?
I mean, I guess our last guest, Emmy, and I'm sure you're very aware of Thomas Szasz and his work. Our last guest was a gentleman who was a close colleague of Szasz, and we were chatting to him. He's also an existential analyst and works in a kind of a Szassian, I would say, perspective. I mean, we're interested in, what's your take on Thomas Szasz, for example, if I ask you that question?
Yes, so Tom Szasz was a person I greatly respected, and I knew him personally from the 70s onwards, and have had many meetings with him and conversations with him. I broadly agreed with him on the challenge to the idea of mental illness, preferring to think of people's issues as problems in living. I think that was an absolutely right way forward. But of course, some of his ideas led to governments being able to undermine psychiatric care and throwing lots of people who actually needed safe places to be out back into society, where they weren't necessarily better off than in a safe space in a psychiatric setting. Personally, I think what we need is safe places for people to be in when they can't cope with the world as it is. And I have had the pleasure of working in some of those spaces, but I think governments should support those spaces because they are badly needed. Not everybody wants to be part of the rat race, and not everybody can cope with things that happen in their lives. Some people are very sensitive and they break down at some point. And I think it is very important to recognize that this happens, and for every society to have a safe way and a constructive way of receiving those people and enabling them to see through that process that they're going through. And that is much needed.
I was going to say, I think I totally agree with you there, Emmy. I mean, I feel that, I think you were saying about politics, and it's interesting, isn't it, that there's a lot of adding up in modern politics, and it seems to be a narrative of blaming people who don't have the same ideologies or have the same values as other people. And I think just because other people don't share your values, doesn't mean they don't have a right to exist. And I think we can
Yes, exactly.
inflict a lot of pain on people by judging them for the way they live when they have as much right to exist as we do.
Yes, absolutely. And there is also the question of whether some people who are going through a psychotic episode might actually need the time to do this without being filled up with medication, instead being guided to explore and discover what lies on the other side of psychosis. And if we don't have safe spaces in which they can be enabled to do that, then the only other alternative is to inject them with antipsychotics and try to insert them back into society. I personally don't think that is the right way to deal with those things. But that is what can be the result of the kind of Szaszian view of the world.
And can I then ask,
which is pretty ways, it's pretty harsh, It's about we all need to cope in the world, and we should be treated equally, which is all very good and well. But sometimes people can't be equal. Sometimes people need to take the pressure off, and they need others to look after them for a bit. And we need to be able to do that for each other as well.
And I guess that's, I must admit, I'm very sympathetic to Szasz, but it's his libertarianism where I've maybe fall out with him a little bit. And I guess in some ways, as you've said, it's all very well be a libertarian, but ultimately some people do need help. And I think ultimately, we have to have some compassion to help other people who maybe can't help themselves.
Absolutely. Or for a particular time, a period of time, can't help themselves. And the other thing that I always disagreed with him on is that there are different types of psychiatric issues, And some of those are physically based. He argued that none of it was physically based, but that is just not the case. Some people are born with autism and have no speech for many years, and they too, need to be treated with certain care and with the kind of support they need to be enabled to live decent lives. To say that those are problems in living is not a fair account of their difficulties. And the same is true in other situations. Dementia, for instance, is a psychiatric problem that you cannot deal with in a libertarian way. You have to have a kind of illness model to deal with that.
Were you going to say something, Matt? Sorry.
Well, the question didn't really follow because I was asking, maybe we can go back to it. So I think you were mentioning your earlier concerns with how some of Sasz's ideas were then worked with. Would that be more in terms of how people have taken it and used it to make the case for how we then do or don't provide help for people, as opposed to being central within his ideas to begin with? Or do you feel it is the sort of libertarian approach actually has that at its center?
No, very concretely, those ideas were used to close down psychiatric institutions across the world, really. It was a period when many people lost access to care and where many people ended up living in the streets and becoming homeless instead of being in a psychiatric establishment. That was a better solution.
And would that be central to Sasz's ideas, as opposed to how the government then thought, actually, then given these ideas, we can work with them because it allows us to justify these kinds of closures? Or so is it more of a kind of interpretation of his work, or was it quite central to what he was claiming in the first place? And it sounds like it's more of that former one where governments and others around the world decided, on this basis then, we can justify these kinds of closures, rather than it being necessarily something that he would have advocated to begin with?
Well, he was in favor of the closures, and he was quite harsh in his assessment of people who use drugs or alcohol or who commit crimes, taking the view that we're all responsible for what we do and those people no less than anybody else. And of course, that is true, and I agree with the principle of it. But in practice, some people just can't take the step to taking that responsibility for themselves for periods of time. And if you don't provide support, mental health support and therapeutic support for people when they are in those situations, it becomes almost impossible for them to free themselves of that predicament they find themselves in. So that's where I was always at odds with Tom, because he was very principled about things and he held on to those principles even in the face of bad situations where I think human sensibility required us to see the limits of his particular perspective and take a more humane perspective.
And where do you think we are now globally, or even if in any particular country? We're currently, I think, sat within the UK, so we could even look at the context here. Do you feel as though some of that balances back? Do you think now we've got a place where we are dealing well with some of these issues, or still we've got so much to address in terms of how we help people with these kinds of issues, help us all with these kind of issues?
Well, on the plus side, we are more open to counselling and psychotherapy and to the notion that it is important to help people understand their problems in living, but that is still very limited. On the whole, it's almost worse than it's ever been, because when somebody makes a suicide attempt that is serious enough for them to become sectioned, and they find themselves in psychiatric care, more often than not, they are just medicated and left to their own devices. And there is very little emotional support and very little real understanding that they can come to in that process to help them out of that situation. So what we still do too much is to simply suppress and oppress people who can't cope, rather than enable them and show them a new way of approaching the issues. There is also very little aftercare. So there is much less social care now than there was 20 or 30 years ago. So people get very little support in finding work in safe spaces where there would be some kind of managerial support of their mental health issues. There is so much more understanding of this needed in our society. It's quite worrying. So if you can't cope with life as you are expected to live it, if you can't cope with 9 to 5, and you can't find a job in which you can thrive, and you come to a halt in your life and something goes wrong for you, the prospects of you getting the kind of support you're looking for are very slight.
Emmy, do you think, because I mean, my experience, I'm currently volunteering with a charity organization, and there are people out there. People do help one another, don't they? So do you think this is a political problem? Yes. I mean, there's no political motivation to provide the support for people? Because I think on the ground, my experience is people love helping one another, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. People love helping one another. And you're talking about the voluntary sector. The voluntary sector is amazing. Many of my doctoral students work in voluntary settings and they love it, and they learn the job very well. What I was talking about is state provided mental health care, really very dire. There is very little psychotherapy available at that level, and that's not acceptable. The actual financial support of mental health care is very small and needs to be increased, and every government keeps promising that mental health care will be put on an even keel with health care. But what's actually happening is that our health care is going down the drain, and our mental health care is going down the drain with it too. So yes, the voluntary sector shows you that people's hearts are in the right places, and that they want to understand their fellow human beings, and they want to provide them with the therapy they need. But even voluntary organizations are finding it much harder to get financial support, and lots of grants have disappeared. And so the situation is not getting better, it's getting worse, and that needs to be reversed.
So whilst there's a general more openness to this, to these other counselling and psychotherapy approaches, in practical terms, through funding cuts and political reasons and so on, actually, we're finding it's not going in the right direction. It's, if anything, worsening. So in terms of coming back to some of the broader questions, and I know this is something that's very close to both Louie and my hearts, it's in the title of the podcast, The Existential Files. So we've talked about existential therapy, counselling, coaching, and you touched upon what that might look like. Can I just ask, sounds like a basic question, but coming back to this idea of existentialism, would you then describe yourself, perhaps it's an obvious answer, as an existentialist? And what would that mean to be an existentialist? Because it's something that Louie would describe himself as, in part. I would be interested in your take, Emmy, in terms of what do we precisely even mean by existentialism?
I don't see myself as an existentialist. I see myself as somebody who is interested in existential issues, and I'm an existential, not an existentialist philosopher. And let me just explain to you what the distinctions are here. So existential philosophies are philosophies that investigate the whole of existence, not just of human existence, but also of human existence. And I conceive Athenian philosophers like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, and also the Roman Stoics, for instance, as existential philosophers. And then there are other existential philosophers like Spinoza, who devised a whole ethics system around his understanding of existence, but they were not existentialists. Kierkegaard and Nietzsche were not existentialists either, although they too brought philosophy back to an existential way of conceiving of the issues rather than a scientific way of conceiving of the issues. Now, that is extremely important to do that. But then in the 40s and 50s in France, we had the school of existentialism, with people like Sartre and de Beauvoir, Merleau-Ponty, and Ricoeur, and many others. And that was a very useful, productive strain of existential philosophy, which I am very interested in, but of which I also see the limitations, because they became quite obsessed with the concept of human freedom, for instance, in a way that wasn't necessarily most helpful to the understanding of people's problems. So as an existential psychotherapist, it is important for me to be able to be open to all these different philosophies, and particularly to phenomenology as well, and not to constrain myself to existentialism per se. Of course, there's lots of post-existentialist philosophy that is equally relevant to doing existential philosophy. And all of those resources, including Eastern existential philosophies too, as you can find in Buddhism or Taoism or even in Confucianism, there are loads of ideas there that are helpful in exploring people's existence. And if I called myself an existentialist, then I would just narrow it down to a very small number of philosophies that, although I include in my work, are not sufficient.
I think that's an excellent answer. I find that so helpful, just in those words you've spoken there, in terms of getting my head around it. And it goes back to what you and Louie were saying before, when Louie was talking about, well, existentialism, perhaps, again, you can correct me on this, idea about this, liberty and autonomy and power. And you were saying, well, also, actually, what's key is the limits of that. And maybe you felt that the existentialism as an approach had overemphasized one rather than another.
Yes, completely right. That is my main problem with existentialism, is that it is a bit too idealistic. The later Sartre, of course, in his critique of a dialectical reason, became a bit more connected up with those limits. And he became, like Merleau-Ponty, much more aware that freedom is always extremely narrow margin of possibility in a person's life, that maybe for 75% we are a product of our society, of our experiences, and for 25% we have a margin of freedom to alter something with that or to reinterpret that in a new way. So the freedom is not that 100% freedom of the early Sartre, which is what existentialism often interprets it to be, that I can make any choice at any time to do anything I like, which is simply not the case, because there are many obstacles, practical, social and moral, and personal as well, personal limitations that stop me choosing many things and that drive me forward to do pretty much the same things I've been doing for a long time. And to just find for every person that modicum of freedom that allows them to turn things a little bit, a tiny little bit at a time, until they find a little door or a little window that they can open to begin to allow some change into their life, is a big job. You can't just sweep this aside by saying, oh, well, you can just choose everything you want. That is a nice principle, but it is not actually borne out in practice in most people's lives.
Absolutely. I'd love to end it just there because I think you've got so much caught within that one. I wanted to at least, though, and Louie may have some more questions, but so when we started, we talked very much about your role as an existential therapist, and we mentioned that we'd had a couple of guests that had studied with you. So is this something people can still do? Are you offering courses where people can study in this area of existential therapy?
Yeah. Indeed, we have created the Existential Academy in West Hampstead, where we run several things, including the new School of Psychotherapy and Counselling. We run 2 doctoral programs there, where we train counselling psychologists and psychotherapists in the existential tradition. We also run 5 master's programs, one in coaching, existential coaching, psychotherapy studies, one in autism, one in pastoral care, diversity studies. So we also run short courses, and we are incredibly active with 75 staff members and 300 students, helping people to train in this modality and work practically with people at all those different levels. We have ongoing sessions and conferences and all sorts of things, with an active presence on social media as well.
I mean, for me, existential therapy, it sounds like a very humane way of helping those in need. And I think we need more of it and more helping people at what can be some of the hardest moments in their lives, you know, and I say thank you for telling us about it. I mean, it was very interesting.
You're very welcome. You might be interested to know that because the existential approach is open-ended and allows people these explorations, it actually is being adopted all over the world. We had a World Congress for Existential Therapy in 2015 with 550 people there from all over the world. My books have been translated into languages like, well, Scandinavian languages, Greek, Hebrew, Turkish, but also into Russian, into Chinese and Korean. And there are people in all of those countries and continents that are adopting existential principles, weaving them together with their local wisdom and their local understanding of people's concrete problems. So this is not just a London phenomenon. This is an international, worldwide phenomenon, with people searching for more sensitive, more in-depth and broader ranging philosophical ways of understanding the human predicament and helping people resolve their problems and live more meaningful lives.
Briefly before I drop away, yes, I just wanted to get, it's probably more of a question we could have started with, but it was just asking, Emmy, so when you were just saying how essentially how your work and this kind of area had such an impact around the world, your book's been translated in all languages and the World Congress, I thought it was fantastic. My mind went back to your beginnings then, as in what brought you to this area initially? Were these ideas and issues that you were fascinated with as a child? Is it something really as a young adult where you started exploring philosophy more formally and you're taking this direction? I was just curious to what was maybe the spark, first of all, that maybe brought you into this area where you've subsequently had this big impact?
Yes, well, I was born in the Netherlands at the end of the Second World War, and my parents had lost everything. My father nearly died in the war, and several family members were killed in the war. And so I grew up with a huge awareness of the difficulty of human existence and the dangers around me. And my parents sensitized me to the need to understand other human beings in order to avoid further wars. And they made me travel and talk with people. And so I became very interested in understanding what motivated people to live either in a positive or a negative way. And I began reading philosophy and many novels as well, of course, from very early on. And I knew that this is what I wanted to do with my life. Understand what goes wrong for people and understand how we can set it right. And so I went into philosophy first and then started working in psychiatry and then went back and got myself another degree in psychology and then my training in clinical psychology and psychotherapy, and wanted to bring the two together all the time, philosophy and psychotherapy. And then, of course, started exploring others who had done that and learned much from them, and created my own way of doing this, and created these different schools, you know, the school at Regents and the New School of Psychotherapy and various other organizations as well.
And so, Emmy, so Brexit has been disappointing for you then, I would imagine.
Oh, you must be kidding. My entire life has been taken over by Brexit in the past year. I joined New Europeans and was part of the organization of the Unite for Europe March, and was a speaker at both the march in Newcastle and in London, and will be speaking in Prague at the European think tank there, things like that. I've been extremely preoccupied with the fate of EU citizens and with the dangers to the UK of even considering not collaborating with our next door neighbors anymore and jeopardizing 72 years of peace. Yes, it has become a very important part of my life, and I'll keep working at it.
Well, I mean, as a pro-European, and I agree with everything you're saying, you know, the British psyche is a sometimes an infuriating thing sometimes.
Yes, but it's also capable of great goodness, and it's lovely to see how people have responded in Manchester. They are rediscovering those values that we're also very well aware of and capable of in Britain, which is to work together, support each other, and be kind. And I think it's high time we rediscover that and make that the prominent aspect of how we live our lives, rather than the uptightness of the current government.
Absolutely. And on that note, I want to say thank you, massive thank you. I mean, I really appreciate that today. You've really helped me as well, better understand how some of the ideas that link to many of the topics we discuss on this podcast that relate to existential issues link to things like therapy, psychology, philosophy, and so on. So appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you,
Great.
Emmy.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Emmy. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.